on the table is a fairly diverse set of perspectives for you. So hopefully that will get some dialogue and debate going as part of the question and answer session. So, interesting things. We deal with public health, we deal with social media, and we pair these technologies with the emergency situations in which we deploy into in order to provide the social change that we're discussing here. We were using a technology called Palantir recently. It's a technology that was started by the founders of PayPal, and it's a data aggregation program which has really unlimited possibilities. We wrote the program in the past 4 weeks. It was a program where previously it was used for, battle space management and targeting for several different agencies within the U.S. government. And what we've done is we've taken the program and we've empowered individuals on the ground with handheld devices to actually go out and engage in canvassing, surveying, or what we call in the military reconnaissance activities of the local population that were affected by traumatizing events, disaster, civil strife, and or humanitarian crisis or public health issues. And we aggregate the data real time, and it feeds back into our systems, and then we have this rather large macro perspective, where we can apply policy and then we can better affect the tactical changes on the ground. So we do that. There's unlimited possibilities when I think about what we can do within the international sector, whether it's working in refugee camps, whether it's working in conflict zones to be able to apply aid in a more efficient way, because as we know, the aid world is this open-ended kind of bucket for funds that a lot of people tend to steer away from because of the lack of transparency and the fraud, waste, and abuse that we see. And we can actually hold those individuals and the agencies accountable, as well as be transparent to the larger funding bodies that we know around the world. Of course, many of them being centrally located in the U.S. and Europe, especially. So that's the organization. We've used a lot of different programs. Our partner and sponsor organizations are, of course, Palantir, Google, and then some other organizations that you probably haven't heard of, like Org Action. But we utilize this technology to do volunteer management. We've done everything from volunteer management to distribution management and operations and coordinations within the U.S. We're a VOAD. It's a voluntary organization active during a disaster. That's what gives us our legal protection at the state and federal level. And then internationally, we are SPHERE trained and we're HAD registered. If you want to work within the international sector, you have to have SPHERE training, and you have to be within the HAD certification program, or you'll essentially be shut out in the next couple of years. So internationally, we do water, sanitation, hygiene, which is called WASH. We have some nutrition programs. We've done gender-based violence programs. We do camp coordinations. We do low-level and we do higher-level healthcare. The higher-level healthcare that we tend to do is in a more acute emergency setting. So post-disaster, our mission statement declares that we can only work within atmospheres that don't have a larger, more galvanized response. Larger actors, whether it happens to be a government entity or an entity such as the IRC, International Rescue Committee, or MSF, we actually work very closely with them. That's where we can work. So a lot of the conflict zones that you hear about, read about, we're there. A lot of the places that are emerging that you don't hear about, we've been there for some time. And I can tell you with technology and specifically comms and media specifically, a lot of the areas that we work in don't get coverage, and because we're an organization which is privately funded right now, it kind of becomes a hindrance, but at the very same time, we're taking this technology, we know we're working in areas that are going to be very, very, very impactful. To get in this line of work, for those of you who are still students, you have to be a humanist, bottom line, and you have to care about the humanitarian principles. And then, from that point on, nonprofit work or NGO work for most people seems to be something that they get turned off of because they don't think they're going to make any money. There's very lucrative careers out there, I can promise you. So if it's money that you're worried about, well, if it's money you're worried about primarily, probably don't enter this sector. But if it's, that's a fear in the back of your mind and you want a stable environment to raise a family, you have that opportunity as well, and there's you know, some amazing avenues to approach. So we've been very lucky. We've championed social media to really birth our organization, and it started with Facebook after the Haiti earthquake. 2 Marines who decided that, you know, the skills they had gained in over 5 years of combat for themselves could be reapplied within a disaster setting, and that's how it started. We utilize it from everything from you know, high volume, low dollar donations, which are reoccurring on platforms such as Stay Classy, and we can talk about you know, that a little bit more, to you know, larger entities such as Google, Palantir, which I'm sure none of you have actually heard of Palantir, but if you do a little research, you'll find that they're probably more involved than you'd ever know, and you will hear about them very shortly. So when it comes to technology and social change, we've run similar campaigns. You've probably all heard of the Kony 2012 campaign. If you don't know anything about the LRA or Joseph Kony, that's fine. Most people, I think, who watched the video didn't. But that was done by an organization called Invisible Children. They're based out of San Diego. Ourselves and them are probably the highest users for the site Stay Classy, and that's the high volume, low dollar recurring donation platform. So we're involved with a lot of interesting campaigns like that. The metrics they use to actually push that campaign out is something that's absolutely you know, replicable, and you'll see organizations try to do that. But it's been an interesting ride. We're only 3 years old. We've deployed to over 37 places. We've been everywhere from Mozambique, Burma, you know, the areas that we won't discuss, all throughout East and West Africa, Haiti, of course, in Chile, and then throughout the U.S., as I indicated before.
And my role is leading the healthcare team, so a lot of the work that I do is with clients in the healthcare sector, but I also do corporate work, so a lot of crisis issues preparation, and previously I was with an airline background, so a lot of the staff there actually activated for emergency response as well, because the logistics teams do have experience. But from a very commercial standpoint, as opposed to a humanitarian, I mean, yes, humanitarian aid, but from a commercial standpoint of wanting to give back to society and do something good. So I'd like to actually start by sharing, you know, my thoughts on when Mohan first sent an email saying that he'd like to hear perspectives on how communication addresses or plays a role in driving social change. I thought, how do I organize this? Because no way can social change actually happen without communication. If you look at it from the pure communication theory standpoint, which is not my area of expertise, not an academic here, but in all the work that we do with our clients who are interested in doing stuff in CSR space, philanthropy, corporate community work, it always boils down to 3 things. One is awareness, because without awareness you can't really get any change going. The second thing is advocacy, so who's going to be up there and stand on the soapbox with you to ask for that change to happen. And then the last of which I think is activation. So to me it's these 3 A's normally when we talk to clients about them wanting to do good deeds, CSR or sustainability, how they want to drive social change based on their business model. So if you looked at, when I talked about, you know, awareness, and in the 10 over years that I've been doing PR or working with the mass media, I think the biggest change in this area, okay, it all started when mass media came about, and with mass media came the opportunity for groups, causes, or people to reach out to, you know, an audience that was before unreachable. But then mass media was at the time, early days, controlled by very few people. If you have advertising dollars, you can go out and advertise for a cause, or advertise for a change, or advertise for awareness. Or governments who owned these, and in the old days Singapore was like that, right? All the media was owned by the government, SBC, the radio stations, the media to some extent. But then now the biggest change to me is the fact that individuals have the power to go out and create that awareness. Citizen journalism, one part of it. And if you look at the environmental movement, my colleagues in China are quite involved in watching all those issues there, from how, I'm sure you've read it in the papers, citizens buying their own monitors for air quality, and then contributing that onto a social platform and making people outside of China as well as within China awareness, right? Aware of the situation there as the starting point for driving social change. So I think that shift of ability for people to not just organizations, organized companies, people with money, but individuals to create awareness. I think that's been the biggest consideration for PR people as consultants when we talk to our clients about campaigns. And then on the advocacy front, and advocacy is a lot of what we do, I do anyway, me and my team, especially in the public health area. So you think of all those government health education campaigns, use condoms, wash your hands, safe, all these kind of public health, public education campaigns. That's really one form, the earliest forms of advocacy. And for me, the biggest change in doing communications on the advocacy front with clients over the years has been the two things, right? Testimonials. So in old days, when you put out somebody on the soapbox to say, do this, change this, or act in a certain way, it's always been leaders. So people who are known in the industry, people who are celebrities, but that's changed now. I think the audiences are looking for everyday heroes, believable spokespeople, and so we take that into consideration when we plan communication campaigns for our clients. And then getting to the activation front, I think that's when it kind of gets interesting and it crosses a little bit over with advocacy because of social media and the new online platforms, which I'll talk about I'll share three examples of projects that we've done with different clients. And you'll see that in these three examples, it's those three A's, how we raise awareness for the client on a certain cause, drive advocacy, and then hopefully get some kind of activation from their target audience. So in the activation front, I think we call it like ribbons to twibbons, right? So in old days, you go and you wear a ribbon, and the activation actually, or the call to action actually was a physical thing. Show up at some place, switch off all the lights, or do something. But then now you can do it all online. Spread the word online, take a picture of yourself with a yellow ribbon online, and pass it on. And the platforms for social activation has been really interesting. So I'll talk about one example of that. One of our biggest clients is Microsoft in the corporate technology space. And Microsoft is very big on citizenship because they believe that with technology they can drive a lot of change in society. They've got an interesting program called Youth Spark, where they work to encourage young people the aim is to get more young people to do things, to activate and do things in their community using technology. So for that, they make available free technology tools for NGOs that are driven by students or by children. And they've got a recent new kind of a platform where I would call it micro-giving. So they work with the international NGO called Global Giving. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but they select programs that will support technology, education amongst youths or youths using technology to activate something in society. And then they say, okay, so John needs $500 or $5,000 in order to run this program for disadvantaged youth in some part of the world. So on this micro-giving site, powered by Global Giving, anybody, I can contribute $5. If I can't contribute 5,000, I just contribute 5, but $5 multiplied by a lot, that kind of activation, that makes that social change happen. So that's kind of Microsoft, and through that platform, Youth Spark Hub, actually that's what it's called online. They bring opportunities for small individuals as well as small groups to make their projects, give awareness to their projects, to drive advocacy for their own projects, and then of course activate global donors all around the world to support them. Another example I'd like to share is the work that we do for MasterCard, which is a financial solutions global payments firm. They believe very much in financial inclusion and financial literacy, especially amongst the unbanked, underbanked, or women. So 2 years ago, we worked with the head of comms in APMEA, that would be Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa, the MasterCard here, to collaborate with the UN Women's Group to launch an initiative called Project Inspire. In its essence, it's a very social project. It's an online platform which is open to anybody in the APMEA region, NGOs, individuals, who has 5 minutes to change the world. 5 minutes pitch on video uploaded onto this Project Inspire website to say how they would use the $10,000 grant money to implement some form of social change as long as it benefited women or was in line with financial inclusion or financial education, which is what MasterCard as an organization wanted to do. And then they through social media, through online platforms, PR, advertising, marketing, we drive people awareness of this site. We actually got a lot of participation from everywhere. You get it from Africa, Philippines, all throughout the region. Very, very good response. All the finalists got together in Singapore, and they were, even if they didn't win didn't win the grant, they had the opportunity to pitch their idea to a panel of venture people who will advise you on how to put together a business proposal for venture capitalists. So even if they didn't win, as long as they participated, they had some benefit out of it. The platform to showcase their project, get the awareness, to encourage the online audience groups, about I think 8,000 plus viewers now, and spreading the word to other people about their projects, and then activation, of course. So that's I felt it's one of the examples of how communications can drive social change at every level, from awareness to advocacy to activation. The last example I think I will share before passing on is the work that Shandwick does directly with a pro bono client of ours for the WWF Worldwide Fund on Earth Hour. So Earth Hour, as you may or may not be familiar with, has a yearly initiative. 7,000 cities around the world take part in it. Switch off the lights, turn off, be in darkness for an hour to drive awareness of saving resources, conserving precious resources that the Earth spends, that we all spend. It started off in 2007 in Australia, in Sydney, and then in 2008 it became global, and Shandwick has been working with the WWF Earth Hour team since 2008. I think this is one of the, if not the only, global NGO that's based out of here, Earth Hour. Earth Hour's HQ relocated here this year, or last year, I think this year. And so the work we do with Earth Hour, it's very interesting. It's, of course, working through the mass media to raise awareness of the initiative, what it's all about, but not just through mass media. There's also direct outreach to organizations to participate, so companies, ministries. And then the newest platform, if you go to the Earth Hour website to have a look, it's driving advocacy and activation very much using social media. So on their YouTube channel, there's this "I will if you will" campaign. So I will, paint my head red if you will switch off the lights for an hour or so. I will shave off my hair. So it's encouraging individuals to pledge what they would give if somebody else would go on to participate in this cause. So I think that's kind of it. I think it's personally, I think it's an exciting time for organizations that are looking to drive change, social change, because never before has there been such an opportunity to reach a global audience from anywhere in the world, as long as you have an internet connection, and the ability to access all kinds of resources from organizations who are increasingly aware of the need to be seen as a corporate, responsible corporation that gives back to society. Yeah.
I work for Aware sometimes in my spare time. Unfortunately, being in academic on tenure track, I don't have that much time to spend, good time there. But I'm definitely very much in favor of the kind of suggestions for social change. And media and communications can play a role in that. Having said that, I want to just ask a few questions. And when Mohan asked me to speak on this panel, I was intrigued by the kinds of questions that were set in the little abstract of this panel. So just to reiterate, for those of you who didn't actually read the poster that went out, or the flyer, the three main questions that were there on the flyer were: what is the role of communication in addressing and fostering social change? I'm summarizing a little bit. How can we understand the communication processes that mobilize action? And how can theory contribute towards social change locally and globally? So I want to somehow reformulate this question into trying to look at some of the main terms in there. So we have communication, we have social change, fostering social change, we have theory that is meant to mobilize certain kind of action. So I want to rephrase this question and perhaps asking, what about the contemporary relationship between theory, communication, and social change? And also, perhaps what does the positing of communication as an instrument for change and theory as a form of reflection obscure or perhaps assume? And I am interested myself in, and that's most of what my academic work is on, very much based on my kind of activist experiences, is what kind of ideology or material reality is this particular relationship between communication, social change, and theory implicated in, perhaps? Or what is it embedded in? What kind of material reality? So from the sort of questions that were in the abstract on the poster, I think one can deduce a couple of sort of grounding assumptions. So one of those assumptions is that communication as well as theory are tools that are as such not related to social change. Like you have to make that happen. That's what I'm reading in the outline. Also that communication processes can be understood through theory, can be harnessed, and that theory therefore can contribute to social change by aiding practice and aiding the understanding of communication. But theory is not necessarily a practical activity in itself, right? Or that's the way I read it, that's the assumption I read in the outline. And also, of course, that social change as such is desirable. Truly, it's interesting that within the little abstracts on the poster, it does not specify what kind of social change. I think this is telling in certain ways. But the category of social change is very, very broad. Although, of course, I think that we all have a certain idea in mind when we talk about social change. But it's very well possible that those ideas might be very different, and also that certain ideas that some people may consider social change, somebody else would not necessarily consider positive social change. So I want to delve a bit further then and complicate one of those main terms, which is social change. So this necessity or urgency for social change, which I as an activist and an academic also very much feel. In the contemporary world, where there's certain pervasive types of violence and aggression and oppression, certain kind of positive social change is very important. I think though that also this sense of urgency of social change also, and you mentioned the word as well for it, has a sort of background in a humanistic ideal, right? And not necessarily saying that this humanistic ideal is specifically Western, but I think it's rooted within a specific idea of how justice can be or should be enacted, and that it has not been enacted enough today, right? That the violence sort of outweighs the forms of justice. I think you mentioned at the beginning also that the ideal would be an equal and just global and local society. So there's not enough of that yet. Right? So perhaps one could say that positive social change, maybe to specify a little bit more, would perhaps be that kind of social change that maybe fosters respect for others and for their cultures, maybe the protection of peoples and communities from violent dominance, especially under global capitalism, and perhaps a kind of change that fosters the preservation of radical others, that is, not trying to subsume everybody under global capitalism. So the preservation of what in continental philosophy we call radical alterity. I'll use this word a few more times. But I want to put a side note to this kind of idea of change as well. So we have this idea of social change that we're seeking to foster. There's not enough of this. But change is, of course, also the hallmark and watchword of contemporary capitalism. Even, say, brands like Philips Electronics, National University of Singapore. I don't know if you've seen the advertisements that were on the buses and on banners a few months ago. It's like all about the desire for change, and yes, inspires for positive change. I think you mentioned it was also in the mission statement actually at NUS, which is very interesting. So NUS is also about social change. Now, of course, this would make one a bit suspicious, right? Or it would make me a little bit suspicious, yes. So I would then immediately, of course, think that this, if NUS even espouses a certain desire for social change and views in staff and students, there must be a very profound economical imperative behind this kind of change. Singapore being what it is, right? NUS being what it is, there must be some kind of economic calculation there. So I suggest maybe that this obligation for social change, on the one hand positive, is also today implicated in the contemporary economy, which is, as a matter of fact, obsessed with innovation, an innovation economy. And innovation and change not being quite the same thing, but I think that's perhaps also what NUS is aiming for, right? Innovation, especially technological innovation, which is a big deal in NUS. After all, Singapore doesn't have natural resources, so blah 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 blah. You know the story. So technological innovation, and I think here another complication comes in, which is the term communication. Now, communication is one of those very much contemporary imperatives. And communication has this aura of some kind of indispensable good. I think you mentioned also in your presentation that if you want to create awareness, if you want to have some activation, etc., you must use contemporary communication technologies. It's assumed to be a necessary thing. And communication as such suggests some kind of good. So, if you just browse also through business manuals, self-help books, what have you, you will always find these kind of phrases like communication is essential for a good relationship. Many books, many academic books also foster this kind of idea. So also to communicate faster and better and more efficiently through new media, for instance, seems to be the logical and rational thing to do. So communication, yes, right? It goes almost like one questions. But, once again, all things seem good there. But communication today, of course, also increasingly happens through those media technologies that are also intimately intertwined with the neoliberal economy. We're coming back to the economy again. And especially to a certain form of globalization and technological globalization, especially through media corporations, but also maybe not the traditional media corporations, but today very much through ISPs. Obviously, when you do social media activism, if you do activism through Facebook, who is laughing behind the curtains is the Zuckerberg, of course, and together with that the US economy, partly. So this is, again, there's a certain kind of implication in the economy there. I'm not saying necessarily this is evil, right? But I think we ought to be aware that this is what is happening. So information dissemination, and also when we talk about communication as dissemination of certain information, and the sender has a certain kind of intent as an activist or academic, then that must also today entail a certain displacement of that intention towards the acceleration of this economy, if you get what I'm saying. And so if the imperative is to communicate for social change through these ever newer media technologies, then the original intention for positive social change also will always engender economic acceleration through these new technologies, and therefore may also contribute to a possible negative fallout of this economic acceleration. And so it's a very, I'm trying to paint a bit more ambiguous figure of either social change but also of the idea of communication. So then another complication comes in. What is the function of theory here? Right? To understand communication, to understand how one can harness it for social change. Now, theory, if you just take its root meaning as thinking, surely happens inside and outside academia, but we're talking about a very specific kind of theory here, obviously. And I would suggest that each practice, whether it's inside or outside academia, activist practice, also always assumes a certain theory or an idea of how justice should come about. So even if one is just being quote unquote, being an activist doing stuff in the world, it always has a certain grounding theory or ideology about that justice should come about and how that justice should be made to come about. So then in turn also, in light of the first two complications of this social change and the idea of communication, those already have a certain kind of slant to them, it seems that this particular panel already has a foundational theory of communication and of the positivity of social action, which perhaps initially goes unquestioned. Both the communication and social action seem to be goods that need to be enacted. Right? So if this is the case, and our founding theories of communication and social change already assume the universal goodness of communication and their technologies and social change in general, right, together with also its negative perhaps side, then perhaps those theories can also be seen as implicated in the reproduction of privilege under this economic acceleration, because the theory is geared to this particular kind of aim, if you will, and reproducing this particular kind of idea. So it seems that to conceive a good theory in this particular case would be the kind of theory that can be made productive as a very specific kind of activity, a sort of practical application, if you will. But I think theory is more than that, right? Especially from my also academic humanistic background. I think theory, and one can see that here, can also shed light on this particular logic of the relationship between communication and social change, and perhaps also question some of the foundations and some of the economic foundations of this particular relationship. So, complication number 4. Summing up from all this, I think there is a certain profound contradiction underlying our ideal of communication for social change. So if communication indeed would lead to the realization or the actual, materialization of the senders or the activist academics' intention for social change, then, if communication actually would be able to do this, I intend this particular social change and I implement it through communication, it disseminates identically, and it will do exactly that on the ground, then one could say this is also a totalizing gesture. Right? If communication would in fact be able to do that, this would be a totalizing gesture, but possibly would also reproduce the privilege of the activist or academic and the privilege of that kind of theory that underlies communication for social change. So perhaps miscommunication is a very important part of communication. Perhaps miscommunication, or maybe even non-communication, would sometimes actually foster more the kind of possibility or the survival of radical alterity than communication. I see people looking puzzled, but can still follow. Right? So maybe because communication has this particular totalizing imperative and is implicated in a certain ideal of social change that has a negative side, perhaps one could say that in a certain incident, not communicating would be the better thing to do. Now, I'm just saying this because, not to say that we should all drop everything now and just sit still, right? But I'm saying this because I want to point out that there is a profound contradiction in place in both our activist and academic enactments. And that these kind of, the ways we enact justice nowadays are themselves implicated in certain kind of grounded in certain logics today, economic logic, but also ideological logics. So this then also means that if new media technologies appear to harbor the ideal or the promise of dissemination for social change, the miscommunication or the slippage, which I mentioned earlier, may actually increase the possibility of non-totalization under capitalist globalization. And this also means that the significance of media representation perhaps exceedingly consists, and I'm saying this because I'm interested in this from a feminist point of view, that media representation should not be so much anymore, an analysis of media representation should not be about content, but it should be about what the content obscures, rather than what it makes visible. So, from this contradiction, I think there's a certain kind of predicament for the activists and the academic, but also for the subjects of social change, the kind of social change, the people that are affected by certain ideas of social change. So on the one hand, there's the possibility of the emergence of radical alterity under economic globalization, which consists actually in non- or miscommunication. And on the other hand, the survival of many others today, paradoxically, also lies in them submitting to the modern theories and technologies of communication. In other words, indeed, communication once again becomes an imperative. But this means that by virtue of inserting themselves within the global logic of imperative of communication, they will be giving up on their radicality. In other words, radical otherness disappears if it gets inserted in this new global imperative. So, in other words again, to render the other into a communicating subject is itself also an act of oppression. It can be an act of oppression. And desire of the other to communicate with the activist or academic is also a product of an increasingly oppressive world. Right? It's what Gayatri Spivak calls a coercion disguised as an invitation. Right? So, just to sort of sum up from all this, and these are very sort of preliminary thoughts once again, right? I'm just throwing them out there, and they're not necessarily practical, right? So bear with me. I think the assumptions of underlying communication for social change may enlight the curious relationship between a certain promissory and instrumentalist ideal of communication and its complicity in a very specific and totalizing form of technocratic globalization, which is also predicated on the very idea of change itself. And one could perhaps trace this idea of communication back to its nascence in North America in 1940s communication theory, which is today actually called information theory, the 40s type of communication theory. And it's, I think, problematic idea of meaning as channeling objects through channels, right, exemplified in the model of signals and signal redundancy. So, and this particular understanding of information theory has perhaps led to a too optimistic understanding of modern communication and its social possibilities, and positive social possibilities. And it has also, I think, led to the moral obligation towards communicative transparency and effectiveness. So the above implies that pressing for social change, or as an academic responsibly enacting the call for social change, and as an activist, via certain practical productive theories of communication, actually leaves certain prevalent values and ideologies very much unquestioned today, and certain aspects of the modern economy very much intact. Actually, it reproduces and accelerates this. So these aspects then consist especially of the relation of the supposed virtue of innovation and acceleration, as if this is progressive and means progress for all of mankind, right? And as if the eradication of radical authority signifies progress. And there's also the spread of a profoundly militaristic idea under neoliberal globalization. And I think maybe this can be tied in to some of what Ford said. And of course you can see this in the ideas, the activist communication ideas, and the phraseology, if you will, ideas of target groups, the ideas of campaigns, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the word campaign comes from the French campagne. But campaign, initially in English, meant the operation of an army in the field. This is a campaign. In the 1600s, this is the word campaign meant. So the form of economic acceleration that such communication and its theory of harnessing it is implicated in entails a certain, perhaps also non-change, a problematic non-change in favor of contemporary power and privilege. And our quest for justice, I think, must then also question the form this quest for justice takes today. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
As a way for setting up the talk, I want to begin by sharing some statistics in terms of social change, because social change and communication for social change is nothing new. In fact, if you look at the history of communication, Howard earlier talked about the Morrill Act in the 1940s, in the post-World War II period, going up to the 1950s. The Office of War Communications was founded on the idea of communication for social change. So in that sense, Ingrid, your notion of campaigns, having this war metaphor, is really well positioned, because that really was where communication and the theorizing of communication began from. The statistics I want to share, though, is that between 1950 and 1990, $38 billion were invested in communication for social change interventions. Okay? In the same period, between 1950 to 1990, if you look at the global economic order, particularly manifested in Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient now is a measure of inequality. And you can look at Gini coefficient by mapping countries and seeing how Gini coefficient spreads out within countries, as well as you can look at Gini coefficient globally. Simultaneously, a trend between 1950 and 1990 that you observed was that inequality was on the rise globally. However, there is a picture that even is more dramatic. Between 1990 and 2010, another $28 billion have been invested in communication for social change programs. Along the same time, and particularly going back to the later half of the 1990s, coming into 2010, global inequalities have increased dramatically. So this then goes back to the question that Ingrid raised: if we have been doing so much communicating for social change, how is it that global inequalities and if poverty is, and that's how I understand social change, measured in the material reality of people that are living in poverty, how is it then that poverty has persistently increased or stayed fairly stable across the globe? Another question then that builds with this point is that how is it then that when we have been running these social change interventions, our measures of effectiveness stay limited to questions of attitude and attitude change without really investing in the broader issues related to questions of poverty and marginalization that we have so-called been attempting to address through our social change interventions. Building on that then, fast forward to our contemporary context, and not only in Singapore but as a global trend, what we observe is that the Gini coefficient continues to rise. So inequality in Singapore, for instance, is in its all-time high if you track it over the last decade. Similar kinds of arguments could be made for the US, and similar kinds of arguments could be made for many European democracies as well as the rising giants China and India. So in that sense, Ingrid, going back to your point, the mandate for social change, as I understand it, is fairly straightforward. Social change within this context then relates to the broader domain of inequalities and how we come to understand and work as communication scholars in addressing these inequalities. Having laid that out as an agenda for social change, one of the things then I want to argue is that most often communication for social change works to perpetuate the kinds of marginalizations that are evident in economic inequalities rather than mitigating them. And the argument I will make is that the reason they perpetuate these inequalities is by driving expert-driven campaigns where communities or people that are target audiences are never part of the solution-building processes. So, for instance, when you think about poverty-related policies, policies for the poor, programs for the poor, programs for the underprivileged being developed, these are most often developed by experts like us sitting around the table, which then again goes back to the argument that you raised, Ingrid, is that a question worth asking within that context is, do these interventions and campaigns and programs really help the poor, the marginalized, the underserved, or do they help us as experts, as professionals who are paid to carry out this work? Granted, we get paid much less than our corporate partners working in the industry, and that is a point to be noted, right? But within this logic then, the broader question also that arises through this is what roles do programs like corporate social responsibility or public-private partnerships play? And this goes back to, Valerie, the point that you were raising. In a recent talk at the World Public Relations Forum, I raised the question of measurement. So when you talk about CSR programs or public-private partnership programs, what are the kinds of metrics that we are using to measure the success of our programs and interventions? Within that context then, it's worth asking a program on gender empowerment. To what extent is it really empowering women to be participants in economies? A great example of this are microcredit programs. If you look at the current literature on microcredits, what you see is that, yeah, they have had possible beneficial effects in certain communities, in certain local cultures, but there is also a lot of contradictory evidence that suggests that microcredits are not working, or microcredits are perpetuating further inequities. So the point then there to make is also to understand that social change needs to be complicated and thought of reflexively as both an avenue for engaging with underserved audiences, but also perhaps an avenue for serving the dominant power structures and social and political institutions. So within that context, for those of us that are taking funding from, say for instance, a Philips or a Google or a Microsoft, also need to then understand to what extent our work is implicated in furthering the agendas of the Google, the Microsoft, or the Philips, vis-a-vis serving the agendas and needs of communities that are disenfranchised. Within that broader question, then yet another point to be raised is the question of communication for social change serving as a front. Meaning, to what extent does the work we do become a greenwashing or a whitewashing front for a corporate organization? So, I will give you an example. I was recently reading a report by Shell and BP on its positive community engagement initiatives. And this particular Shell project talked about its work in Ogoni, in Nigeria, as positive CSR and positive community engagement. Now, if you really look at the history of Shell in Ogoni and Nigeria, you will see that Shell was implicated in hiring of military to thwart Ogoni resistance in Nigeria. But that is then reconfigured into a narrative of economic development, sustainability, economy. So the point here to be raised is also to be for as academics and at this intersection of theory and practice for us to interrogate meanings of terms such as sustainability. Right? If you are an oil corporation investing in sustainable CSR, what really is sustainability for you? And how does that sustainability relate to sustainability for the community that is being displaced? In earlier work that I have engaged with indigenous tribes, for instance, one of the things that I've often found is community dialogues or community participation projects are often used in order to co-opt the indigenous community in order to further the agendas of the mining company. And that is often, and this again goes back to your point, Ingrid, used to frame the communication as communication for social change. So in this sense, then one of the concepts I want to begin with is the concept of reflexivity, meaning that one needs to constantly interrogate what social change means, what it means in terms of the current concentration of power, who holds power and who pays for us. I think, Valerie, you made a very powerful point about how more individuals have opportunities for participating in platforms. Yet at the same time, also building on this, organizations deploy tremendous strategic resources in utilizing, say, CSR campaigns or social media campaigns in order to heighten the organizational voice. So the question of power ought to constantly come back in terms of who has the power to define. Yeah? So for instance, in the context of Singapore, when we talk about migrant rights or migrant workers, it's worth asking who has the power to define what is legal and what is illegal. What is normal, what is abnormal, what is the acceptable realm of meaning? What is the acceptable realm within which we come to define what is work? And what is the right kind of payment for work? So all of this is to say that communication is also a space, not only as a tool for social change, but as also a space for interrogating, for questioning, and for also turning the lens on those structures of power that use communication in order to achieve particular aims and goals. I will wrap up then by building on this notion of reflexivity to say, I see communication as social change being a conduit primarily for listening or being a space for listening. And when I say listening, I'm aware of this notion that Ingrid is noting, which is that in any effort of listening or any effort of invitation, is also itself implicated in the goal to co-opt, in the desire to co-opt, in the desire to build in so that you become part of the mainstream. And yet I think, building from your point, there needs to be an emphasis on imagining what the practice of social change looks like for academic activists like yourself, as it relates to listening then to the voices of those communities that are being displaced, or whose voices are being minimized, or opportunities for whose participation are being minimized. And building on that then, I would also talk about this idea that listening should create space for dialogue. And dialogue in this sense, not just as a way for taking a community, then having the community tell us what we want to hear, and then turning that into a top-down agenda, but truly utilizing dialogue as an avenue for changing our corporate practices, our communicative practices, for imagining an alternative world and the vision of an alternative world. And I will wrap up with an example of an organization called Navdanya, which is a grassroots organization of farmers located in northern part of India. Since the 1990s, when India started liberalizing its agriculture, what happened very quickly is that the entire agricultural sector went into the hands of large agrochemicals. So organizations like Monsanto took major market share of the agricultural market. What this also produced as a result is in states like Gujarat, a large number of farmers who had taken out loans to buy the Monsanto seeds and then later on taken out additional loans in order to buy fertilizers and buy water to irrigate their farms, found themselves in the midst of unsustainable cropping, because they had taken into a genetically modified crop called BT cotton, and they found that just to keep growing that cotton, they needed to buy more and more fertilizer that they couldn't afford, and yet they kept taking more loans, and they fell into this debt cycle of loans. As a result, farmers started committing suicide in the state of Gujarat in mass scale. At this point now, every 5 minutes, there are 8 farmers in the state of Gujarat that commit suicide. That is tied to this agricultural debt crisis. So in this backdrop, what the organization Navdanya does is that it says that we have to fight the corporatization of agriculture and the corporatization of the seed. So their imagining of an alternative idea of organizing is to say that we have to fundamentally think about what agriculture is. It's about our personal relationship with food, and it is about our personal relationship with nature, which does not have to be mediatized through the market. So what they do is they do these series of campaigns called Farmers Taking Back the Seeds, where farmers actually save the seeds and pass on to other farmers and pass on through the different cropping cycles so that they do not have to depend upon the monoculture seeds of Monsanto, which, by the way, what is the idea of monoculture? That you can only buy the seed once, you cannot recycle it. For the next crop cycle, you have to go back and buy the seeds, right? So what Navdanya does is it grows its own local seeds and then passes out the seeds to farmers for free in a barter system. So it doesn't go through the cash market for the seeds to be exchanged and further recycled, but it goes through a barter system where someone gives out seeds, someone else gives out water, and the sharing continues in that way. So what that suggests with that example of Navdanya in terms of communication for social change is the idea of social change is not just about replicating what is being suggested and articulated by the power structures in terms of what we have already done and what we continue to do, but it is also about imagining new possibilities. It is also about constantly working to imagine what these possibilities might look like, and it is also about opening up the space, hopefully, to conversation, dialogue, debate. And I always say, more the merrier in terms of engaging these critiques and building on those in conversations. In conclusion, when we think about communication and social change, and as communication and new media, we talk about emerging technologies, but Ingrid's work constantly also makes me wonder and put pause to imagining technology only as a positive thing. Because after all, we have to remember that a lot of the problems we are in the midst of today are a product of these technologies. So if we talk about global warming is a product of the rapid, fast-scale technologization of the globe. So to suggest technology as a solution to the problems that have been created by these technologies might be short-sighted. And I hope that that can open up some space for us to continue these conversations about new possibilities.
I tend to be more on the tactical side of the house, to use another military term, of course, because that's my background. So please excuse those. I'm not militaristic in any way beyond the language that I speak, and maybe some of my basic movements. So it's interesting. We kind of entered into some rhetoric that I didn't necessarily see coming down the road, but this has really kind of opened up some wonderful case studies I've been a part of for the past 4 weeks. When I've been in New York, I've been working on the Rockaways, and I consider it a petri dish for agendas. You have the Occupy movement, you have ourselves, you have all the large NGOs, you have city, state, and federal governments who are all involved. But what's kind of interesting about what we were talking about here is a value system that we've actually placed on social change, whether it was positive or negative. There's clearly some indications that there was a value system there. I mean, I think social change is simply social change, and technology is going to be a part of that regardless. You know, there's corollaries and there's, you know, things that will they'll offset. So some of the issues that we're kind of talking about. So when we talk about global warming, of course, how is it that we, you know, enact change for global warming, and then what are the repercussions of those? You know, we're all part of this massive global society, and I think technology has made that more apparent every day. I just kind of want to bring up 2 interesting case studies that I think are worth mentioning, and we talk about natural change versus interventional change, and you know, you know, once again, going back to please, like, withhold all values and let them let yourself decide towards the end of these. But one interesting case study is taking place on the Rockaways, and we have the Occupy movement out there, and to talk about Occupy as a movement is kind of difficult. It's you know, very large and ambiguous, loosely confederated group of multiple agendas who want to see social change, whatever form that is, and whichever, you know, group within the movement is the strongest at the time. And then we talk about economics and politics, and I think they're fairly interchangeable in this conversation. But Occupy, for example, they were one of the first organizations or the first groups to be on the Rockaways after the large storm that we saw through Hurricane Sandy pushed through the Northeast. We were actually the first nonprofit or NGO that was there, and then Occupy shortly followed. Of course, given their proximity and their base near Trinity and Wall Street, not really a surprise. It's actually wonderful for their platform, and you know, also if you want to remain current because you've defaulted to you know, these traditional means to project what it is that you're trying to get, which you know, you indicated before may not necessarily be the best for them when you begin playing the same game as everyone else. But what Occupy did is they provided a service and a solution very quickly. They provided organizational infrastructure that wasn't there in an area with a lower social economic status, which one, they felt like was the position they wanted to be in because they felt the change that they wanted to see was with that group. However, they also don't want to participate and or collaborate with any other organization and or service provider which may actually be able to provide the people with what they need. We're talking basic public works, public health, education, and funding for what it is that they're going through. So, you know, with good intentions, they've efficiently done the population within the areas that they were working a disservice by not collaborating with larger organizations. And so it's interesting looking at their interventional change and kind of how you know, they may have done a disservice there, whereas if these individuals had simply been left alone, they would have been accessed by the larger service providers, Red Cross, FEMA, other organizations which were out there. So that's kind of an interesting case study, and you can take it for what it is. You know, I think right now we're seeing the death of that movement, sadly, but you know, it's an interesting platform to see them use. Another interesting point I'd like to bring up is, you know, since we're talking about Nigeria, yeah, I think I'm not sure how many of you are following MSF's participation in deployment within regions where there's a substantial amount of gold mining. But there was a, you know, they use mercury and they use other contaminants to mine gold in some of these areas. And there was a large percentage of the population, specifically the under 12 population, which was affected by this mercury and then lead poisoning, and there was a high number of deaths. And Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, came in and they provided a service for these people. And this is an interventional change that we're kind of talking about. And they provided medical care there. And though they saved lives, they've also enabled the people to continue mining gold. So it's it's something where I think retroactively we can continue to talk about theory. I think impulsively as humans, we're always going to try to enact some sort of change, and we're always going to place our value system wherever it is that we happen to be from. On top of that, I grew up in the U.S., and the U.S. of course, the bastard child of a Christian monarchy from Western Europe. So there is certain values which I have instilled in me, which are not necessarily shared across the globe. But I think those are two interesting studies to look at, and I think that when we begin talking about social change, we really have to take a step back from the rhetoric and just understand there's going to be change, whether it's positive or negative, and then that's the simple nature of man. And then applying technology to that also adds a new element. I didn't expect to get into the whole theory portion of things. Like I said, I'm yeah, right. I'm far more grounded in the tactical side, once again, to default to my military linguistical capability. But you raised some very interesting points. I wish that we had some Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan representatives here as well to kind of have this discussion out a little bit further. It's an interesting one to have. So going back, we of course call ourselves Team Rubicon a apolitical, non-religious organization. Once again, we're from the U.S. and we actually collaborated as much as we could with Occupy, as well as collaborating with the federal government, and being kind of the middleman. It's been very, very interesting to see how both kind of ends of the spectrum identify themselves, and though they preach external transparency is very subjective, and the internal transparency is what we actually don't see. So where we were importing their data and exporting our data completely to both organizations, neither one of them would share with anyone, to include ourselves after some time. And of course there's that ominous, you guys are military, you're clearly identified as some sort of intelligence gathering asset, when at the end of the day it was simply some guys with shovels who wanted to pick up some trash. But it's an interesting world. So yeah, we've raised some really interesting points here. I want to definitely continue this conversation.
Yeah. I almost feel like I would take the side of the commercial world here. It's like all this interesting. It's interesting hearing Ingrid's point of view. I guess when we are practicing communications on behalf of our clients, the last thing we think about is media hegemony and dominating a particular point of view on any social change agenda. I will talk about this, this whole thing about whether change is good or bad. I think Ford's kind of like thrown that question out. You've all thrown that question out. From a commercial standpoint, I would say 99.97% of the time, corporations going with good intent. Okay, but it's not a perfect world, and nobody's operating with perfect knowledge. It's almost like medicine. You go out there, you put something out in the market, you don't actually know what the effects are going to be until some years down the road. And then so everybody's talking about sustainability now because most of these people who are using that rhetoric, they have been in the business world for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and then beginning to see the impact of all the work that they're doing in markets, whether it's Monsanto, whether it's Shell, and they realize that to stay in business, so there is some self-interest there, they've got to do something about it. But I would say for the most part, corporations that we work with, they recognize that they're not the experts in trying to make change, and that's why they always have to work with the NGOs. So to the point that they don't know what's happening on the ground, is the change being dictated from up going down? I would say from the commercial standpoint, probably not, because they take the advice from the NGOs and they, I would say, sincerely would like to make that change. How we monitor that, how that's reported, we talk about transparency. Mohan, you talk about communicators or theorists, academics acting as checks asking the right question. I think that's an important role to play, but let's not try to think that corporations, go in with the wrong intent at all these times. And then the other interesting points you raised, Ingrid, was about communications, right? I think as access for marginalized voices, the level of transparency that's out there, I think those are important things, and I believe social media, mobile technology, all of that will play a role in increasing access. But I also like to believe that in a free market, so I'm not American at all, none of that democratic thing, I'm actually socialist. But I think, at the core socialist, but I think that, I like to think in the free market or free marketplace of ideas, if somebody went out there and tried to drive social change that doesn't resonate, that doesn't fit, people don't believe in it, and the people that's supposed to be impacted by that change are not impacted, there should be some kind of feedback that comes back in an ideal world where everything is, where they have the right access to the channels, right?
This is the problem.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
So I think organizations like Microsoft, for example, are working to try and change that and improve access. So yes, I felt like just saying commercial organizations who are sincerely trying to make change for the good.
Yeah, I think also that is, that I for one was certainly implying that all these are good intentions. By the corporations who are involved, even though of course there is a double agenda that's also about profit, but certainly the people who are actually interested in certain kind of social change, of course they don't say, let's make poverty worse. So yeah, and of course, whatever ex-military, I think sometimes, by sort of brandishing the military as the one evil spot in society, people forget that actually all of society is militarized in many ways, and that, our university, a lot of our graduates go to Ministry of Defense or work for, the Defense Technology, DSTA. So let's not pretend that we have nothing to do also with the military as academics or sometimes as activists. So I think what for me as an academic is interesting is this good intentions, the kind of imagination that comes with that, right? The kind of ideas about the tools that we use, and the way in which these good intentions may obscure those aspects or areas of society that cannot get heard. So when, for instance, you were mentioning the issue of the underbanked segments and the women that you want to target with certain communication campaign, then immediately my question is, but when you do this through social media, and certainly Singapore is highly wired, but there are people who are not on the internet, do not have access to social media, may not have the money to spend. So when you're talking about the underbanked, you're already sort of excluding the maybe not banked at all people. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
So what happens in our communication channels is, and also women, and I'm a feminist, I come from a gender studies background, but I find that within also feminist theory and a lot of gender practice, for instance in AWARE, which I'm very familiar with, what gets ignored is the issue of class, very, very much so. And this is actually a problem in feminist theory at large, I think. The issue of class is very much obscured. So when we talk about women, which women is one? What are you talking about?
That's true, but it's also the fact that there are a lot of problems or a lot of issues in the world that needs to be addressed. And how do we prioritize that, and so which one gets pushed up the agenda?
Yeah.
But still, some change or some little steps. Probably better.
So again, right, it's not like to denounce those kind of projects. So it's not to say like we should not do this. It's not like an either or situation. But I think I'm very interested in Mohan's concept of listening. What is this? How can we listen? How can we listen better? And how can we listen to those who do not have a voice? Because that implies one can also listen. This is the problem. I think this is a very essential problem that we have, and with the rising Gini coefficients in most countries in the world nowadays, what becomes that increasingly excluded group from even being able to have a voice or being able to be heard in the first place. Also, in what kind of language this always happen, and this would be another very important thing. We haven't talked about this yet with communication. We're talking about media tools, but English language is very much the dominant medium tool today. So what role does that play in the exclusion of certain groups, also in Singapore, as a matter of fact? So, it's again, I'm not saying one should not,
Sure.
but I'm saying but we must not lose sight of what we're obscuring.
I was often surprised by is that, say you're a funding agency, say UN or WHO, you funded a local NGO to carry out a project. The NGO has hired locals to carry out the project, okay? But the locals as well as the NGO, even though they are closer to the ground, they are still part of a dominant structure. So I will give you an example. I consulted on many so-called family planning projects that were trying to go into these rural communities and telling people that you need to have less babies. So they were thinking that, the NGOs were thinking that they are doing really good work by telling people that if you have less kids, you're going to have less economic sustainability and therefore your family is going to progress, right? So the intent is good perhaps over there. But that too is an ideology. Right, which we typically tend to ignore, which is that the ideology that for the poor having less babies is what makes them economically productive ignores the fact that inequities are a product of structural injustices in how resources are distributed rather than of family size. But even more so, if you were to ask, and that's the part that amazed me, is how often we had very little clue about what people in the ground were saying. And this is for someone, being of the same culture. I speak the language. I go and ask people some questions on the survey. They give me the answers. We design the intervention. And yet that is so out of touch with people's lived experiences. Because if you were to truly ask people what's going on, they would say, I want to have a large family in the family planning context because it helps me deal with my adversity and my poverty. It's a really small answer, right? It's like a very commonsensical, and yet this commonsensical answer does not hit the minds of the NGO or the public health person or the corporation or the funding agency that's funding it. I'll give you another example. The World Food Program, again, I think the intent is good there. That World Food Program wants to solve the problem of hunger, right? And yet if you really look at the measures of effectiveness in the many communities where the World Food Program has done its work, I think the literature is fairly certain about pointing out that World Food Program interventions have very small effects. They typically don't tend to work. Why? If you again look at how the World Food Program is run, what you see is that it is run by people that have their MBAs, that go into elite institutions, go get MBAs, and then they are deployed to Bangladesh and India and Africa to carry out World Food Program interventions. And what kind of interventions do they run? They give out things like these powdered nutritious food, right, that's given out in packets. I have seen in my...
Lumpy nut and C++.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in my field work, I have seen again and again, the communities will come take the packets, they won't use it. They will just keep it on the side and not use those packets, and the packets are heaped up in a corner or are being used for other things. It's again a very simple thing. So in one of these World Food Program meetings, I asked, and this was a series of consulting groups that were present at the table. So Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey, and I asked them around the table, how many of you have actually traveled to rural, this was a case of rural Ethiopia, to actually be in these communities and spoken to these people. And I was surprised. Of the 10 people that were in the room, only one had traveled, and to that one person when I asked, how much time did you spend to the community? She said 6 days, and then I asked, do you speak the local language? And she didn't. This says something about a well-spent intent gone completely wrong because of this whole thing turned into a techno-managerial thing where food and hunger now have become technical managerial problems to be solved by an entity without really engaging with people. So Ingrid, coming back to summarize this, for me the idea of listening is very simple. That you fundamentally acknowledge the human dignity of the other in their ability to have a voice and to speak and to ask them, hey, what do you need? What do you want? How does this make sense to you? That's all.
Yeah. So one of the extra complication number 5, that one could throw in is sometimes these communities are very internally diverse, and there's power plays at work inside those communities. So how does one deal with that as an activist or an academic, whether from NGO or corporation? You go in there, I think a lot of people do try to travel, sometimes a bit like disaster tourism,
Yes.
but some of these, and they actually do travel there because, you know, they can go out after 2 weeks again, that's nice. But how does one deal with those kind of problems within, you know, the power structures within the communities, that those who get to speak to you may actually not be representative of the entire community?
Well, herein lays the fundamental issue with development, and you know,
Yeah.
we try to enact these programs which are written, of course, by academics with, you know, wonderful credentials with that massive disconnect. But we write 3-year programs, we write 10-year programs, and then, you know, the fact of the matter is, when we're dealing with multi-generational conflict, multi-generational malnutrition, these are problems that aren't going to be solved overnight. And, you know, if you really want to do development, you need to look at 75 years plus. You know, these are things that outlast us, and those are the kinds of programs that you're going to need to enact if, for whatever reason, we as humanity decide that we must intervene. Because, you know, the sad reality too is these are so self-inflicted, and as you indicated, there's, you know, issues within many of these communities. Is, you know, and this zooms really far out there, but is it for us to go in for 75 years and to build out these programs and to hope for change in areas that simply aren't sustainable, or to let the indigenous population in these areas, you know, deal with the situation in which they found themselves in? They may be living in, you know, to throw that buzzword out, unsustainable regions for agricultural products. Do we then develop, you know, interventions which are, you know, drought resistant, and we put them in this area, or do we simply allow humanity to work itself out in these areas, like Mother Nature probably intended it to? So these are the real hard questions, and I think we're, you know, we talk strategy in such short periods of time, but those are tactics, and I think anything that we're going to apply within our lifetime is simply a tactic. So there's a long-range look.
But this whole idea of listening is almost like looking at the basis of, before you even think about any advocacy or activation, it's defining what the problem actually is.
Mhm.
And it's down to implementation, right? Tactical implementation, or collecting that information and making sure that it's continually collected, because it changes all the time. The needs of that community could change every 6 months, depending on who's in power and what's the situation. I don't know, I still feel optimistic about it all, because some changes, or some effort is always better than nothing's
Yeah.
perfect.
Well, I think that you're talking about tactics, and I think a role as activists or academics, activists and academics, is also, you mentioned the role of imagination. And I think this is actually where theory thinking can play a role as well, right? Not in maybe immediate tactical, which is also important, tactical, practical solutions, short term, maybe longer term, but about imagining an alternative on a larger scale, because you're mentioning a lot of these problems are structural and not necessarily particular to one location or particular to certain individuals. So I think, you know, as academics, we have the duty to think about this issue of imagination as well, and imagining differently. Which of course is a very abstract thing to say, I realize that, but I do think it's important.
You know, as I was listening to Valerie, in my mind it just went, finally, yeah, somebody here to speak for corporations. And
That's not my prescribed role, by the way. Just for today.
but that's interesting, right, Dutta? Because when Ingrid spoke, I was like, finally, right?
It sounds like one you preached here, right?
Amazing how we. But then also listening to Mohan talking about intent and, in a way, effectiveness, right?
Yes.
I was thinking, see, the managerial way of doing things, the managerial imperative, places a lot of focus on effectiveness, right? Whatever they run, whatever project they run, not in the social space. I mean, every dollar needs to have a return. Now, when they bring that same amount of focus into the social space, which is what I saw in my research, which actually is on CSR done by companies which are recognized for their CSR, you know, for apparently the good guys. So they seem to bring in that same amount of focus into their CSR projects as well. So in terms of identifying the right NGO, for instance, the same due diligence that they spend in finding an outsourcing supplier for HR or IT, they put into finding the right NGO, in evaluating how the money is spent, you know. And in order to be effective, listening is very much a part of the process, right? Now, of course, we can always question how well it's implemented, whether it is in selling soap or in developmental campaigns, right? I mean, listening is the same, whether you're listening to the customer or whether you're listening to the marginalized who don't typically come within the business spaces. So for me, I think as long as the intent and the focus on effectiveness, which they bring into their normal business as usual, is brought into the social space as well, you know, things could just work.
And here's where I think, yeah, sorry.
And often the examples that we hear are from the extractive industries. Poor guys. Okay.
Really poor guys.
I mean, extractive industries, mining, they are there for a reason. And we have had this conversation before, right? But that's not all in CSR. In CSR, there are so many other industries, so many other people entering spaces like whatever, education, health, you know, doing a lot of work. But unfortunately, a lot of the examples that we hear are usually taken from the extractive industries or what's typically called the sin sector, you know, cigarettes, alcohol, sin sector or extractive, which is what is usually highlighted, and therefore the you know, the other positive examples hardly ever.
Yes, but the broader question also is that even when you say school projects, for instance, and you think about public-private partnerships, a broader intellectual question is who should be managing the school sector? Should that be a public sector or should that be a private sector? As we saw with our own SMRT example, what are the implications for an entity being a publicly owned entity vis-a-vis a privately owned entity? So the question also then with the broader question of CSR is that when you're shifting impetus to these basic services being delivered by private entities, what is the role of the state? And even a more broader question, you know, I was listening to a journalist say, I never run CSR stories because that's not what corporations are here to do. They are here to make profit. I can at least evaluate them from that standpoint. So he was saying that CSR is very intransparent or non-transparent as a business because you don't see how that relates to corporate profit making per se, right? And the broader point he was making there is that what do you do when you, for instance, have a private organization funding schools in a community? What are the implications of that for the community, but even more so, what are the implications of that for the state? But he said something more powerful, and I thought this is an important point, which is the question of accountability and observation. So where should accountability be held? Should the state be the entity that is doing the monitoring and holding organizations accountable, or should organizations themselves hold themselves accountable, right? So a great example of this is the financial crisis. So now you have the banks saying, oh, we can self-manage and we can put in all these professional practices and stuff, right? Which again goes against what Stiglitz and Krugman talks about in terms of the lack of accountability within state-based structures that ought to be monitoring and evaluating the derivatives market and putting a strong hold on how the market is managed, right? So the question again with public-private partnerships, I think, is a broader question of where accountability lies and how do we push that through these different mechanisms, right? Because these mechanisms, as Ingrid is saying, are also mechanisms for pushing particular ideologies. At least that's you know, my sense.
I'd like to actually make a comment on Ganga's point on measurement, because I think that's critical even to your point on Mohan on accountability, because how you judge accountability is usually by a certain set of parameters, which is measurement. And that has ever been the challenge for any form of communication, whether for social change or not. And then looking at it from probably a more Ingrid academic point of view is whoever frames those measurements are actually biasing the results towards something else, because companies are very well known, any organization is very well known. If I'm going to be measured on this 5 or this 10 measures, then I'm going to tailor everything to those 10 measures with the exclusion of others. And my view on accountability is the government has to take that role, because they are supposed to be representing the good of the nation and of the people, and they are the ones who are supposedly offering licenses to companies to operate. And they're supposed to act as that check, if not the industry itself as an industry body, and if not, then by the people who would either boycott the products or, you know, other more extreme measures towards companies that don't play their part. But measurement, I think that's certainly a role which academics, people who look at theories, people who look at all of this with a, not dispassionate, but maybe from a neutral standpoint, can probably play a good role. I think the CSR, in the last 12 years or so, CSR to business sustainability, the Dow Jones GRI index, there's been so many of these measures. I don't think any one of them is perfect, but it should be a work in progress, and hopefully we get better ones moving forward.
Actually, it's interesting, I think maybe for our visitors, that we reflect and respond to our speakers in who we are, perhaps as researchers too, because Ganga does CSR research, so she was thinking about points Valerie is making, and I'm thinking, yes, Ingrid, finally somebody problematizes social change. And not in a way that we're saying or trivializing what happens on the ground, but this idea of what that represents, right? And by that, what we bring to the table, and I really like your point that by addressing that and putting that on the table, we must not forget what we obscure or what we forget, or what we push out on the margins. And whether social change, in a way, has become sort of the in thing, right? The thing that we talk about, things that we strive to, because technology makes it more accessible. But at the same time, I think from the kinds of research that I do, I immediately think, who's left out, who's missing? Does everybody have access to those technology? And can we truly have social change that addresses inequality by just using technology that is in a space that is already accessible by certain people, right? So are we then back to that cycle of talking about social change, and has technology really helped us move towards addressing inequalities in any way? And so I think this is why I'm saying yes, problematizing social change, not to say that what happens in the ground isn't important, because I am also a practitioner, and so I'm always looking for ways to connect theory to research and to see how we can move that forward. But I think it goes back to how we think about social change and how we conceptualize social change and ideology that brings to it, because I think if we ask everybody in the room how we define social change is going to reflect, right, perhaps the kinds of things we would push for or the kinds of things we would work towards, even though in the end we all agree it's about social change.
Maybe we should ask everyone in the room.
Yeah. And you, the four of you, are a good representative of that, right? In terms of how you began talking about social change, and how you use social change, and how you think about social change, and what it reflects is very diverse in terms of how you yourself have talked about social change.
I was very interested in Ingrid's concepts of communication, miscommunication, and non-communication. And I was thinking that how from the epistemological that you come up with these ideas, and then how ontologically we can also already, or maybe already, have implemented in our previous projects in a structural way. For example, I'm thinking of that if we consider that communication is never transparent, if the fallout effect is already in it, then communication has the possibility of being miscommunication at the same time. So basically, the communication and miscommunication is the a dialectical pair instead of a binary kind of we stop thinking about this communication, or we tend to this miscommunication. In this way, I'm also thinking of how CCA culture-centered approach has structurally kind of think about this, not in terms of miscommunication, but then I'm thinking that by using yours, communication, miscommunication, and non-communication as a new framework to look at that, and then we can find that the actual actions in the previous programs, so that you can find a kind of like already organically grown stuff in the previous program. I'm thinking of for each project that we are now conducting, we're using the advisory board, and then the advisory board for each project was actually composed of the majority of it is from the research subjects, and then also from the NGO members and also our research. And in this way, it's kind of thinking, taking into consideration that, okay, our expectations of a communication is not the standard. We are not only expecting to hear what we want to hear, but we also expect something that will surprise us, or maybe even baffle us, something like that. So maybe we can consider that as structurally opening ourselves as researchers or as non-workers to the kind of communication that we are we do not know before. So I wonder if that's
Yeah,
would be an
I
interesting
hope I
way
sort
of
of
thinking.
followed your point, but it's a bit an academic point. I think some of the problem of this, I try to explore in my work, at least with the idea of hospitality, which is a much more continental philosophical idea. But also, I think, I'm not sure if this is what you're suggesting, but it sounds to me like if one can incorporate communication, miscommunication, non-communication, or the certain idea of being surprised into another overarching theory of how one can communicate effectively, then perhaps it will work better. Now I would say this is a contradiction in terms. This is exactly the definition from communication, is that there is always miscommunication as well. I think that I work more for a hermeneutic perspective, so there is no identical communication in the first place. So the possibility actually of miscommunication is always there. It cannot be harnessed. Miscommunication cannot be harnessed. So I think a lot of the sort of logic that sometimes we try to enact is try to predict, try to harness, but I think the virtue of miscommunication is that exactly that it cannot be. And hence I like what you say at the end when you say be surprised. I think it's nice to say there must be some kind of openness, but this is very, very difficult. I mean, what does one mean with openness, and what does that mean in terms of a researcher or also of an activist, to have a certain kind of openness? I think it's a fundamental concept actually, it's a hospitality towards the other. Again, that openness can also not be too extreme, obviously, because in order for miscommunication to happen, there also needs to be communication. So the two are, like you say, right, they're sort of an inextricable pair. But the point of it all is that this is where the social sciences will fall short, because it cannot be harnessed. This is exactly the problem, or the point, or the possibility. That's perhaps also the promise of the surprise. Yeah, sorry. Did I understand correctly what you were trying to say?
I still think that in a philosophical level it cannot be harnessed, but then there's always this kind of tension of openness that is creative for every researcher. In the actual program, we need to consider it in a kind of implicable way to say that for the infinity or philosophical infinity of impossibility, we cannot do this. But then actually for every project, for every opportunity, or every human encounter, there's a certain kind of openness that we can perceive, we can receive, and then accept being something new.
Yeah. I must say there that also, because one can think, for instance, of that classroom situation.
Yeah.
And in terms of a certain openness towards the students, what are the concerns that drive them, what are the concerns that I'm projecting onto them, what are the concerns that they cannot voice because I'm voicing very particular kinds of concerns. So this is, for instance, a question for me within the classroom, but also in activist practices. I think what is important to keep in mind there that it's also to be able to choose to some extent to be surprised also entails a position of privilege in the first place. To have a certain steady ground already to stand on. Right? One can only be open if one feels safe enough oneself. So there's a curious watching there going on that, and again for each of us as researchers may mean different things in different contexts.
I don't want to pick on Ingrid all the time, because everything has kind of been directed at you, but I was wondering whether there's perhaps a complication number 6 that we
Sure
need
there
to
is.
talk about as well, which is that it's great that you have, and perhaps there's still some power in new media to kind of broadcast some of your ideas, what you mentioned about, accessibility and awareness, but perhaps part of the problem is then the people that you are fighting against know exactly who you are and what you're planning, which introduces its own complication into using new media for communication. For instance, a recent example, Verse, I don't know if people are familiar with that particular example. That was the Malaysian elections. There was a group of academics as well as kind of NGOs that got together to protest against unfair elections in Malaysia because there are many problems with the system, and so they wanted clean and fair elections. And most of the communication about the protest happened via Facebook. And on the surface, that was really successful because on the day of the protest, people changed their profile pictures. There were all kinds of posts saying, yeah, I'm going, aren't you? So there was a lot of social pressure about why aren't you there with us? But on the other hand, when this mob of people got to the place where they wanted to protest at Merdeka Square, there was a list of guards already waiting for them. And they kind of sectioned off the place, not allowing them to go to the place where they wanted to have the protest because they knew exactly what they were planning. And then what happened was, after a few hours, they opened up the gates and people flooded in and they threw tear gas at them. So they were waiting for them and they tear gassed this entire mob of people. Later on in the evening, some of the organizers, when they were going back to their cars, after a relatively peaceful demonstration, there were groups of people waiting in dark alleys. Are you Dr. So-and-so? Yes, okay. And they literally pulled out sticks and they started to attack the very people who were protesting. So, yeah, they got massive support. They got a lot of people to go and to protest. And there was actually one of the few examples where people showed up and not just, clicked like and didn't come for the event. But the major problem was that the people they were protesting against knew exactly what they were doing.
Yeah. This is actually why Singapore doesn't mind all that much when you do certain political activism or voicing online, because they can keep a tab on what's going on.
But was that not successful?
You're
I mean,
talking about-
because what are the desired results? Because you're talking about it right now, and we're talking about long term. I was having this conversation with Gary Kasparov 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure if there's any Russians in the room.
That would be
Of course. So we were discussing utilizing cell phones and identifying yourself through voter registration through cell phones. And the power is the transparency there, because that's exactly, you're getting exactly what you want and the attention that you want. Someone has to be the martyr in the end. I mean, especially if we're talking about long-term change. And so this is, maybe, initially the tactic was, yes, you utilize social media, you utilize cell phones, GSM theory and everything else, you can pick you up. But that type of transparency is also your protection. And so, for those, who are willing to go down that road, that's just how it begins.
Just think Egypt and meet at Tahrir Square, 14th December, and look at the Arab Spring that started from a Facebook post.
It's now an Arab autumn, apparently.
Well,
We had the same problem with indie media already years ago when we had a huge anti-WTO protest in Brussels. And that was just the beginning of indie media at that point, and indie media trying to, self-publish and disseminate images about the success of the protest, how many people turned out. But the problem was, these images got uploaded, the police, very easy time of picking out the people who were on the forefront of these protests and jailing them. So, but this is one of the consequences that initially we didn't realize that it would have that effect as well. So there's more risks than involved in engaging oneself with these kinds of protests. And are people necessarily willing to take a risk? Maybe the Bercy next time will be a bit more careful trying to use social media. By the way, I heard many other stories about Bercy as well being a very middle class, certain type of race. Kind of
I was
political
going
party,
to say
so-
that didn't have the desired effect for the reason that it's
Yeah.
a very specific kind of movement, and one of
Yeah.
the effects that one of the things that they protest was the building of the Linus facility, which has all kinds of environmental impacts and impacts on the community of the east coast of Malaysia. But when people came to protest against Linus, people drove up from the city to protest, because the people who were actually involved in that neighborhood were not part of the network that was involved with Bercy. So they were not of the right social class, they didn't have the right connections, so their voices were not actually represented during the protest against this thing that was happening in their neighborhood. So yeah, absolutely.
That also raises a question, about social media and really in terms of connecting it to, or even just new media and social change. Because think about the places you're working in, or the places that Mohan's talking about, where it's, regardless of whether it's disaster or not, but access to technology, and if you're trying to protest a regime or protest Monsanto, would you be able to mobilize that community using that kind of system? And is it going to have the same kind of effect? And if you do use that kind of system in that place, who is involved? Exactly what Anna is saying, people who are already part of that network, people who already have a certain ideology. So does it really get to, I think the point I was trying to make earlier in terms of what is social change, and does it really get to inequalities, addressing inequalities, if social change means that, right? But if it means individual activism, individual participation, then that's going to have a different outcome, right? So then again, it's, to what extent does technology allow us to really get to places what we're not talking about here in terms of examples, but certain places you are in, when it's in a disaster, certain places Mohan has been using as an example, and perhaps even in terms of, ideology that Ingrid is raising in those people who are missing, and then even Valerie in terms of when you say women who don't have access, or that in terms of ideology it's there, right? But again, going back to who's involved in that process and who's left out. And if people are being left out, aren't those the people we're really trying to get at to begin with? But then how have we gone back to where we started?
This is kind of an issue that we have in the US military as a whole too, is this dependency on technology and what it is that the desired results that you want. We are very, very dependent on signal intelligence in order to action the targets that we deem necessary for the desired results that whatever they want. So is it, I know we're talking about technology here, but have we become dependent on this technology once again? Do we have to default to the grassroots methods that were so successful in the past? I think technology is simply a tool. It can be a force multiplier. But, to alleviate, to throw away everything from the past is just kind of silly. And in those areas, we can't implement the same kind of technology that we utilize in our lives in these places. It's just bottom line, the education and understanding of how to utilize it the way we do is not there. And so that's why, when you look at the world as a whole, it's, that's, when we look at poverty and we look at healthcare, do we measure it to our standard? Or do we measure it to just, progress in many of these places is measured in millimeters. and it is long-term development. And I think, we're all part of this global community, especially here talking in this room, that wants instant gratification. And I think that's a problem that we tend to see. So I don't know.
And why perhaps we default back to technology as a way, because in abstractness, I guess it gives us that instant gratification. We can sit here and imagine ourselves in, somewhere, let's say in Africa, in Nigeria, going back to that, and how we're going to mobilize that community, and how we're going to, bring the solutions, healthcare solution to this individual, right? And then how sexy that technology can be in that space. But when you actually get to that space, right, is that the reality, and are we in fact making that worse, or are we really bridging that gap?
That I want to ask some specific questions, and I want to hear, Valerie, your thoughts, Ford, your thoughts, and then maybe Ingrid, your thoughts theoretically, particularly as it relates to using the technology to solve particular social change problems, right? Because I think the few things we were demonstrating, Ford, is that there are specific places where the technology actually works to accomplish very targeted objectives, right? So could you talk about that and use that as an example to think about how communication plays out there?
Okay. So, I guess there's two good examples that I've been a part of. In 2010, I was in Caracas, Venezuela during the first elections for the opposition, and we were utilizing text messaging to discuss violence in the barrios and to identify, kind of just like an alert system resource, what it was that was going on, because at the time I think there was roughly 20,000 murders or homicides in the country, which far outweighed Baghdad, which was an area that I'm quite familiar with as well. Understanding how that technology was used there and applying it at that very basic level empowered the people to identify the issue, and I think that was a positive use of the technology for social change that we see now. Regardless of the political situation in Venezuela, it has become far more apparent that the rate of homicides is climbing, but we've also empowered the people to bring that to a platform which we can all see, though of course Western media outlets don't necessarily pick that up. Now that's one form of technology that we've utilized, or that I've been a part of. Now from Team Rubicon's perspective, from the organization that I work for at the moment, we used a system called Palantir, which I've discussed. It's a data aggregation tool, and people always say, well, what do you do with that data? Where does it go? Who's holding it? And we export everything that we have that it's not, as long as it's not in violation of HIPAA, because people do have a right to their own privacy, and they've self-identified that they want to be part of our system. We don't simply force this upon anyone, which is very important to note. We're not purchasing lists for political campaigns or anything like that. This is not invasive. This is a physical presence at a door. This is that personal touch in which we ask, is there an issue? Is there something we can help with? And we were providing a very, very specific service, which was gutting people's homes, taking off the drywall, removing the insulation, and it's essentially mold remediation, and mitigation techniques. And that's it. We tried to be very clear as to what services we were providing, and then individuals would walk up to us. They would go ahead and fill out a work request form, or they would use, the mobile teams would have these devices that were based on Android phones, and the individuals would come up utilizing this Palantir system with these Android phones, and they would form a work order. They would take a picture before. The team would immediately be dispatched, because this is real-time streaming data. The team would then go out there. The second team that would come in, that was doing the mold mitigation, would take a photo during the actual activity and fill out this work order. The fields are, it's up to you what type of fields you want to put in there as a whole. And then there was a completion portion where a photo was taken after the work was completed, so that we did have the ability to audit the teams that were out there working in different capacities, whether it was the canvassing capacity or the initial surveying capacity, or the follow-on team that did the mold mitigation. So this was a process that formerly took, hours upon hours in order to just aggregate this data because of course the labor involved. And this was something that was utilized for, on paper and on Excel spreadsheets. And there's also some platforms out there, the Mormon Helping Hands, which is a VOAD, once again a voluntary organization active during a disaster, an NGO within the US. They use a Google-based platform which deals with their volunteer management. But there's nothing as comprehensive as this, which allowed us to manage volunteers, deploy them to tasks, engage the local populace, and also in an open source and very transparent way, in which, like I indicated before, all the fields and all the data would be dumped to any and all individuals that were interested in it. You're doing, the populace a disservice by not giving them access to an overarching system, which is, it's sad that it has to do that, but that's just the nature of beast. We had a very small window of time to work with. So if everyone simply self-deploys as spontaneous volunteers and shows up there, there's no accountability of work. The public health ramifications for just releasing groups of individuals which are, grassroots in origin to do work with, no check and no oversight, could really just perpetuate the problem and really lengthen the whole process. And actually, we are seeing that because of the failure from the larger organizations to respond in a timely manner. But having that real-time data, being able to observe on this platform exactly where it was our teams were, and then being able to share that data with other agencies or organizations which are non-affiliated, non-aligned, in order to kind of task out the work, it expedited the process. And we were also able to tap into open source data that simply wouldn't be shared otherwise, such as electrical, public works, gas, and that gave us a more specific picture of what was going on. And I understand how that can be really ominous and terrifying to some people to have that much power. But if it's shared power, then I think that it's an acceptable risk. Otherwise, you run the risk of simply allowing people to fend for themselves to a certain extent. I guess that may simply be something where we talk about intervention versus the natural progression of things, but I think that's difficult as human beings to allow to happen anyways. I'm not sure how many of you have been involved in mass casualty situations or seen large amounts of, a large number of human beings who are not alive or dying in the process, but it's very difficult to process. And if you haven't been exposed to that, or violence on that scale, I think it's easy to make assumptions. And the nature of NGO work is you have to be detached to a certain extent. That's just the reality of the situation on the ground. When you want to work in Africa and you want to work in cholera treatment units and you want to work in CTCs, you have to get used to very strict and defined conditions in which you work, or you let the epidemic simply run its course. So it's hard to say, and there's a lot of different things with that, whether it's spraying yourself off with chlorine and changing your own clothes, or changing the burial practices of a host community simply because of what it is that they've been exposed to. But that's simply the nature of the game within the NGO and nonprofit circles, especially within public health.
Valerie, did you want to talk about the role of technology and what you have done?
Well, I think it's been a long and very interesting debate already. But I tend to agree with the general opinions that have already been expressed and thoughts articulated that technology is a tool. As a means in itself, I guess not, comes with its own ills as well as its benefits. But we have seen clients work well with technology. I think looking at it again from a commercial standpoint, it's always been what are the results and what can we show, right, for our efforts as soon as possible. And technology tends to allow that because it does hit, I guess, the most number of people, or the lowest hanging fruit perhaps, or the quickest outcome that you can possibly expect. But I read last week on the Microsoft Health blog, they have one of an interesting initiative on working with an NGO in India on tuberculosis. So anybody familiar with tuberculosis would know that one of the worst things about it is if you get it and you don't treat it, the chances of infecting people around you, especially your own immediate family members, is very high. And what's even worse is if the patient is not compliant with the medication, they take 1 or 2 courses and then the disease, the germ, the bacteria gets resistant, and then you spread on a more resistant bug, which is even worse. So compliance was one of these issues, and Microsoft, in this particular blog post that I read, worked with the NGO to create, using technology to create a tool for the NGO teams on the ground to log and identify the patients that they were and the families that they were following up with for TB. I thought that, I mean, it's something as basic as a laptop, portable laptop, that the aid workers brought with them to the villages and said, okay, I'm going to fingerprint this guy as evidence. So it's kind of like trying to improve the implementation process of creating a kind of checks and balance to the implementation process. This is the individual that I have checked, compliant, has been briefed, educated, etc., and it's fingerprinted. So it's just simple things like this that I think technology can play a role in and has been playing a role in. The other one, I think lady at the back, so I didn't catch her name, about financial inclusion, technology, places where not everybody has access to mobile phones or internet. I think mobile phones probably is an interesting, or mobile technology is probably an interesting one which a lot of companies are looking at, not only for microfinancing, but also for things, and I've read a recent example that was done, I think again was Microsoft with Grameen in Africa, where it's as simple as giving the latest weather reports to the farmers and market conditions so they know what price is fair to sell their products on. So simple things like this, I think technology again, just as an enabler, as one of the many, many tools, but certainly it does open up new possibilities. Let's not discount it. Yes, it will exclude some, but I still think if we can make decisions, or again with the intent, and reaching out with the limited resources that we have, we as a whole collectively, organizations as well as private sector, then let's try and aim to do as much good as we can with whatever we've got, right? Lowest hanging fruit. Biggest impact, shortest time.
Okay, Ingrid, 1 minute.
I mean, I mentioned Indymedia already. I've worked with them for a very long time. I did various gender projects, multimedia, European Union projects, environmental projects, which at some point I realized it's a bit paradoxical to use the internet in order to, promote awareness of climate change, etc. Because those are the very technologies that cause climate change. Maybe you want to switch off that computer. But, not to forget, this stuff is also done on a very new technology. And so, which I think is also important, again, as academics to realize that these are also our daily uses of technology that may contribute to global warming or whatever it is. So I'll end with it.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you all for participating and for really engaging this panel. I want to thank Hoofd and Ingrid and Valerie for all the points that you have shared. Thank you.